People call ketamine a miracle. Doctors say it's one of the fastest acting antidepressants we've ever discovered. Club kids call it Special K, the cheap party drug that makes you feel like you're floating. And addicts, sometimes they call it the K-hole, a place where you can't move, can't scream, and sometimes can't even tell if you're alive anymore. This is ketamine, a drug that was born in the lab, sent to war, dragged into nightclubs, and now brought back as a billion-dollar therapy. On one hand, it saves lives. On the other, it can take you to a place so disturbing that people come back shaken for the rest of their lives. Today, we're breaking down the full story of ketamine, how it works, what it does to your brain, the terrifying K-hole, and how this one drug has lived 9 different lives. Ketamine is strange because it doesn't act on the same chemical systems as most of the drugs people are familiar with. Alcohol, cocaine, MDMA, weed, they all play with brain chemicals like dopamine, serotonin, or GABA, which control things like pleasure, mood, or relaxation. Ketamine skips those entirely and instead cuts directly into one of the most basic systems of brain communication. At its core, ketamine is an NMDA receptor antagonist. That phrase sounds complicated, but it really just means this. It blocks a receptor in the brain that normally responds to glutamate, and glutamate is important. It's not just some niche chemical that shows up in like rare occasions. It's actually the brain's main excitatory neurotransmitter. Think of it like if your brain is a city, dopamine and serotonin are like specific neighborhoods, rewarding, calming, and balancing. But glutamate is the power grid for the entire city. It keeps the lights on and makes sure different parts of the city can talk to each other. When ketamine blocks glutamate signaling, it scrambles that grid. Neurons stop firing in sync, and regions of the brain that are usually tightly connected start drifting apart. One of the networks that gets hit the hardest is called the default mode network. The name sounds dull, but it's basically the control center for selfhood. This network ties together your sense of identity, your personal memories, and your constant mental narration of reality. In other words, it's the system that tells you who you are and anchors you in the present. Scientists first noticed ketamine's strange effects during anesthesia studies. Unlike other anesthetics that simply knock people out cold, ketamine leaves part of the brain active. Brain scans show a weird pattern. Some areas go quiet while others light up in unusual ways. It doesn't produce a simple off switch like alcohol or opioids. Instead, it's more like pulling out a key piece of code in a computer program. The software doesn't completely shut down, it glitches. That's the essence of ketamine science. It's not stimulating, it's not sedating in the usual sense, and it's not classically psychedelic either. It's disruptive. By blocking glutamate and silencing the default mode network, ketamine pulls away the brain's ability to stitch reality into a smooth, continuous experience. What's left is fragmented signals, stray images, and a mind that's conscious but not grounded. This disruption is why doctors can use ketamine as an anesthetic. It disconnects pain perception from awareness. It's also why researchers in psychiatry are interested in it. That temporary reset of the default mode network may help break the rigid patterns of depression. But at the same time, the same mechanism is also what makes ketamine one of the most disorienting and disturbing drugs on Earth. Once you know what ketamine actually does in the brain, the next question is, what does that actually feel like? The answer depends completely on the dose. Ketamine is not a one-size drug. The difference between a light dose and a heavy one is like the difference between dipping your toe in the pool and being shoved into the deep end with no way up. At a low dose, ketamine usually feels floaty. People describe it as dreamlike, as if gravity has let go of them. Sounds are muffled, time feels slightly slowed, and your body feels light, almost disconnected. Some people compare it to having a glass of wine and lying in a warm bath. not exactly euphoric, but detached in a pleasant way. This is the level where it can feel calming, even meditative. It's also the range that doctors aim for in controlled therapeutic settings where patients may feel distant from their problems without fully losing touch. As the dose increases into the medium range, the effects start to warp reality itself. This is where the brain's disrupted communication begins to show up as confusion and distortion. People might feel like their surroundings are melting or bending, like the floor is tilting, or like their body is stretching in strange proportions. It's not exactly colorful hallucinations like LSD. Ketamine visuals tend to be sharper, mechanical, and more fragmented, like looking at reality through broken glass. Movement feels clumsy, language starts to slip, and thoughts get scrambled. This is the range most associated with club or party use. The trippy but still standing dose. Even here, the detachment can make users stumble, black out moments, or feel briefly trapped inside their own body. Then comes the high dose. This is where ketamine crosses into its most infamous territory: full dissociation. At this level, your sense of body, self, and time starts to collapse entirely. You may lose the ability to move or speak. Reality can feel like it's been shut off, replaced by bizarre visions, alternate worlds, or just an empty void. Users describe being pulled out of their body, hovering above themselves, or watching their life from a detached perspective. This is what people call the K-hole, a place where you're conscious but not in control, and where the normal rules of time and space no longer apply. The disturbing part is that this isn't gradual. The shift can be sudden. One moment you're laughing with friends, feeling floaty, and the next you're locked in, unable to communicate, convinced you've slipped into another reality. For some, it's euphoric. For others, it's the most terrifying experience of their lives. The K-hole is often described as a kind of ego death. Your identity, your memories, even the sense that you are a person can disappear completely. People talk about slipping out of their body, floating above themselves, or suddenly being in a space that has no connection to the room they were just in. Some describe it as watching themselves from the outside, as if they're a character in a movie, while others feel as if they've been launched into an entirely different dimension. But what makes the K-hole disturbing is not just the detachment, it's the tone of the experience. On psychedelics like LSD or shrooms, ego death can sometimes feel warm or spiritual, like you're merging with the universe. Ketamine is different. People often describe it as cold, mechanical, and glitchy. Instead of opening new doors, it feels like your entire brain has crashed. The imagery can be bizarre, almost alien. Reports include feeling like you're abducted, experimented on, or dissected by strange forces. Some describe being trapped in endless time loops where the same moment repeats over and over until they can't tell if they'll ever escape. A common theme is being buried alive in your own body, fully aware but unable to move or speak. The brain is active, but the body has been cut out of the equation. And while some people frame this as mystical or enlightening, just as many describe it as absolute terror. There's nothing playful about being convinced you're dead or that you're stuck in a void forever. It's not uncommon for users to come back shaken, with the sense that they've touched something they weren't supposed to. The K-hole is the clearest example of why ketamine is so different from other drugs. It isn't exactly just change how you feel, it pulls apart the entire structure of consciousness and leaves you stranded in the wreckage. It's not a doorway to higher meaning like LSD is often marketed. It's more like your brain glitching out, the operating system freezing, and reality being replaced with something broken and unrecognizable. For some, that brokenness feels liberating. For others, it's the most horrifying experience of their lives. Either way, the K-hole is where ketamine's science meets its darkest reputation, a space where identity and reality dissolve into cold, mechanical nothingness. One of the most unnerving parts of the K-hole is how unpredictable it feels. Two people can take the same dose and end up in completely different universes. For some, it's a slow slide, drifting further and further from their body. For others, it's like falling through a trap door. One second they're in a room with friends, and the second they're somewhere else entirely. The sensory distortions hit every part of the mind. Vision can fracture into sharp geometric grids or collapse into total darkness. Some describe it as watching reality stutter like a broken VHS tape, repeating frames out of order. Sounds get warped, voices stretch and echo, or cut out entirely, leaving people convinced they've gone deaf. The body itself stops feeling like a body. Limbs feel detached, oversized, or even missing. People talk about looking down and not recognizing their own hands. Then there's the paralysis. In the K-hole, many users find themselves unable to move at all. They can think, they can sometimes even hear what's happening around them, but their body won't respond. That mismatch creates a terrifying locked-in sensation, like again being buried inside your own skin. Some people compare it to anesthesia awareness, where patients wake up during surgery but can't signal to the doctors. It's a conscious nightmare. The way time breaks is another defining feature. Minutes can stretch into what feels like hours. Loops form where the same moment plays again and again, until the person isn't sure if they've been stuck there forever. In one account after another, people describe living through entire alternate lifetimes in just a few minutes of real-world time. When they finally come back, it leaves them shaken, sometimes with lingering doubts about whether their real life is just another layer of the hallucination. And unlike classic psychedelics, ketamine rarely delivers uplifting visions. LSD or psilocybin might give you a sense of cosmic unity, a feeling of being connected to nature, or a flood of colorful imagery. The K-hole, by contrast, feels sterile and alien and clinical. The spaces people describe are cold, metallic corridors, endless voids, or again, like operating tables where they're being dissected by beings they can't fully see. Now, the aftermath of a K-hole is just as disturbing. Some people come back exhilarated, convinced they've glimpsed hidden truths about reality. Others return traumatized, rattled by the sense that they were gone for years, dead and reborn or experimented on. Even among those who say they enjoyed it, there's often an edge of unease, as if they touched something that humans aren't supposed to touch. The K-hole also, it doesn't just scar on memory, it scars on identity. People sometimes struggle for days after, feeling unreal, detached, or anxious. The line between their normal life and the void they fell into can blur. And that lingering uncertainty, the thought that the world might glitch out again without warning, is part of what makes the K-hole so infamous. If the mental side of ketamine is disturbing, the physical side is just as brutal. Long-term heavy use doesn't just mess with your mind, it leaves permanent scars on the body. The most notorious effect is what is called the ketamine bladder. Doctors started noticing this in the early 2000s among people in Hong Kong and the UK who were using ketamine daily. The drug irritates and inflames the bladder lining, causing ulcers and scar tissue. Over time, the bladder shrinks and stiffens. The result? Constant pain, an urgent need to urinate every few minutes, and, in many cases, total incontinence. Some users have reported being unable to leave their house because they have to pee dozens of times an hour. Others end up in emergency rooms passing blood. In the worst cases, the bladder is damaged beyond repair and has to be surgically removed or bypassed with a catheter. Imagine starting out using ketamine for fun and ending up with a permanent tube just to pass urine. That's the level of damage we're talking about. And it's not just the bladder. Heavy use also strains the kidneys and liver since they're working overtime to process and clear the drug. Chronic ketamine users often show elevated liver enzymes and kidney dysfunction, warning signs that those organs are under serious stress. Then there's the brain itself. While ketamine is being studied for its potential antidepressant effects, frequent recreational use can lead to the opposite: rebound depression and memory problems. People report difficulty recalling basic information, trouble focusing, and an emotional flatness that gets worse the more they use. Instead of escaping reality, the drug leaves them stuck in a gray zone where their moods are lower than ever. What makes all of this more disturbing is how quickly it can set in. Some heavy users report bladder symptoms within just a few months of regular dosing. It's not a distant long-term risk, it's a rapid breakdown that sneaks up on people who think they're only dabbling. Ketamine doesn't cause the same kind of physical withdrawal as heroin or alcohol. You don't get the shakes, cold sweats, or seizures when you stop, but that doesn't mean it's safe. The danger with ketamine is psychological dependence. Because of the way it severs you from reality, ketamine can become an escape hatch people start relying on. Someone going through depression, trauma, or boredom might take it once to feel detached, and suddenly it becomes the one thing that makes them feel outside of their life. The pattern often turns into binging, people redosing over and over, chasing that feeling of weightlessness or detachment until days blur together. Instead of being physically hooked, they get trapped in the cycle of needing ketamine to feel anything at all. This kind of compulsive use is especially common in nightlife and party culture. In clubs or at raves, ketamine's short duration and powder form make it easy to re-up constantly. Users will snort bump after bump, thinking they're keeping the buzz alive, but before long, they're lost in the dissociation. The drug that was supposed to make the night more fun leaves them silent, collapsed in a corner, or carried out by friends. And that vulnerability opens the door to something even darker. In the 2000s, ketamine gained a reputation as a date drug. Like GHB and Ropanol, ketamine can knock someone into a state where they're conscious but unable to move or resist. They may not even remember what happened afterward because of the memory blocking effects. Media reports about sexual assaults in clubs and house parties drove that label home, making ketamine almost synonymous with exploitation. And while that reputation sometimes got exaggerated by scare campaigns, the core danger was, and still is, very real. Behind the flashing lights of clubs and the casual party chatter, ketamine use often hides disturbing realities. People slumped in bathrooms, unable to stand, users too dissociated to say no, exploitation that thrives in those moments where someone is detached, paralyzed, or completely cut off from control of their own body. So while ketamine can be framed as a therapeutic tool in one context, in another it becomes a weapon, not just self-destructive through dependence, but used against people who never chose to take it. And that double life is what makes it one of the most unsettling drugs to ever circulate through party culture. While ketamine was showing up in clubs and raves, another group of people were exploring it in a completely different way. Not for fun, not for medicine, but as a tool to push the boundaries of consciousness. In the 1970s and 80s, a small circle of researchers, writers, and psychonauts became obsessed with ketamine's ability to break reality apart. To them, it wasn't just a drug, it was a gateway. They believed that by shutting down the brain's normal sense of self, ketamine opened doors into entirely new dimensions of thought. The most famous figure in this scene was John Lilly. Lilly was a neuroscientist best known for his bizarre dolphin communication experiments and his invention of the sensory deprivation tank. In the 70s, he started combining those float tanks with massive doses of ketamine, isolated in darkness and silence with his brain completely dissociated. Lilly claims he contacted alien intelligences. He wrote about entire conversations with beings he called Echo, the Earth Coincidence Control Office, and later a darker force he named Solid State Intelligence, which he believed was an artificial machine consciousness trying to control humanity. Lilly wasn't alone. Other experimenters at the time described traveling through strange geometric landscapes, communicating with entities, or accessing hidden layers of the mind. These stories gave ketamine a cult following among underground psychonauts, people who saw it not as a party drug but as a kind of chemical spaceship. Of course, from the outside, this all looked disturbing. Lilly was dosing himself with ketamine daily, often to the point of complete collapse. His alien experiences read less like revelations and more like symptoms of a mind that was breaking under the weight of constant chemical dissociation. But his writings spread, and they helped build the myth that ketamine wasn't just a drug, it was a key to something beyond ordinary human reality. Even today, traces of that cult fascination linger. Forums and niche communities still treat ketamine like a tool for exploring consciousness, citing Lilly's work or their own experiences in the K-hole as evidence that something out there is real. But whether you see it as contact with higher intelligence or just the brain glitching under chemical assault, this side of ketamine shows how deeply it can reshape the human experience. It's not just disturbing because of the damage it does, it's disturbing because because of how far it can pull people away from consensus reality, and how willing some are to keep going back. Ketamine's story starts in the early 1960s. In 1962, chemist Calvin Stevens at Park Davis Laboratories first synthesized the compound while searching for a safer alternative to PCP. At the time, PCP was being tested as an anesthetic, but it had one major problem. Patients often woke up in terrifying states of psychosis. Stevens' new molecule, ketamine, seemed to solve that issue. It knocked people out quickly, wore off faster, and didn't leave them trapped in the same long, violent delusions. By the mid-60s, ketamine was approved for use in humans and animals, and within a few years, it was deployed on the battlefield. During the Vietnam War, ketamine became a staple for combat medics. It was praised as a battlefield anesthetic because it didn't suppress breathing the way other anesthetics did. Soldiers could be given ketamine in the middle of chaos, even while severely injured, and keep breathing on their own. It was cheap, portable, and reliable, and for many, it was literally life-saving. But ketamine's usefulness wasn't limited to humans. It was also widely adopted in veterinary medicine, especially for larger animals like horses. That practical use eventually gave it a nickname that would stick in popular culture: the horse tranquilizer. Media outlets in the 1980s and 90s loved to hammer that label, often ignoring that ketamine was equally common in human operating rooms. Still, the stigma fueled the image of ketamine as something crude, dangerous, and not meant for people. That image collided with a very different world in the 1980s and 90s, the underground rave and club scene. Ketamine powder started circulating at warehouse parties, music festivals, and nightclubs where it was snorted for its dreamy, dissociative high. It was cheap compared to cocaine or ecstasy, and dealers often sold it in the same environment, sometimes even mixing it into cocktails of drugs. Partygoers called it Special K, Vitamin K, or just K. At lower doses, it felt floaty, but at higher ones, people stumbled into the infamous K-hole, sometimes right there on the dance floor. By the end of the 90s, ketamine had lived multiple lives: a lab discovery, a battlefield medicine, a veterinary anesthetic, and a controversial party drug. That strange history set the stage for the paradox we're in today, where ketamine is once again being rebranded, not as a club drug, but as a billion-dollar mental health treatment. For decades, ketamine was seen as either a party drug or an oddball anesthetic. But in the early 2000s, researchers stumbled upon something shocking. When given at low doses, ketamine could relieve severe depression within hours. Unlike traditional antidepressants, which can take weeks to kick in, ketamine seemed to work almost immediately. Patients who had been suicidal one day sometimes reported feeling stable and even hopeful the next. That discovery changed everything. By the mid-2010s, ketamine had gone from being demonized as a rave drug to being hailed as a potential breakthrough treatment for mental illness. Ketamine infusion clinics began springing up across the US and abroad. These were private centers where patients could pay out of pocket, often hundreds to thousands of dollars per session, to sit in a chair, get an IV drip of ketamine, and ride out the dissociation under medical supervision. The boom was fast but also messy. Most of these clinics were cash-based and barely regulated. Insurance rarely covered the treatments, meaning only the desperate and the wealthy could afford them. And while some clinics were run by legitimate doctors, others operated more like boutique spas, advertising ketamine as a wonder drug without much oversight. The stories that came out were mixed. Some patients found incredible relief, while others were left financially drained, cycling through temporary highs followed by emotional crashes. Sensing a gold mine, Big Pharma stepped in. In 2019, Johnson & Johnson rolled out Spravato, a nasal spray made from S-ketamine, a slightly altered version of the ketamine molecule. The FDA approved it specifically for treatment-resistant depression. The price tag? Thousands of dollars per year. And because it was branded, patented, and FDA stamped, insurance companies were more willing to cover it compared to generic ketamine. The disturbing irony is that in the 90s, ketamine was vilified in the media as a dangerous club drug, associated with exploitation and psychosis. Now, the same substance, slightly repackaged and rebranded, was being sold back to the public as a miracle cure at a massive markup. Big Pharma had essentially taken a drug they once condemned and turned it into a billion-dollar business. For patients, the results can be life-changing, but the bigger picture raises unsettling questions. Is ketamine ketamine truly a breakthrough therapy, or just another example of corporations monetizing desperation? The answer may be both, which only makes the story of ketamine even stranger. Now I want to talk about E by Echo 2K, an album I love. I have never done ketamine before, but I fell in love with this album as it uses addiction to ketamine both as a plea for help and a lens through which to see depression and many themes. What makes E such a haunting album is how it doesn't just talk about ketamine addiction, it sounds like it. Echo 2K builds a sonic and lyrical soundscape that mirrors dissociation. Thin, translucent vocals that float like they're barely tethered to the beat, minimal production that leaves more empty space than resolution, and words that drift between confession, surreal imagery, and fragmented loops. The album becomes less of a collection of songs than a simulation of what ketamine actually does to the mind. It dissolves structure, slows time, and makes reality feel mechanical, dreamlike, and alien. Take the intro, AAA power line. The lyrics hit straight at the helplessness of dissociation. Backseat of some car, zip tied up, can't move my arms. That image of paralysis isn't abstract, it's the kind of bodily detachment K-hole users describe, being awake but unable to move. The repetition of lines over and over and over mirrors the looping thought patterns that ketamine creates, where a single phrase or feeling replays endlessly. Even the title, referencing a power line, suggests that he's carrying some invisible charge, maybe like that nervous system buzzing while the body itself won't respond. Echo's delivery, thin and chant-like, sounds less like singing and more like a transmission, as if he's not fully present but speaking from somewhere in between. Then there's Fragile, which takes the dissociation inward into the body and psyche. Lines like, wake up happy, wash my face in acid, I'm glassy, shattered, wrapped in bubble plastic, capture that uncanny mix of numbness and sensitivity that ketamine addiction creates. You feel untouchable and breakable at the same time. His metaphors, gasoline, kerosene, broken jaws, teeth cracking, aren't just about fragility, they're about self-destruction, hiding under gloss and surface shine. The Swedish outro, which means in English, breathe in, breathe out, follow the light, could be read as a kind of dissociative mantra, almost medical, like someone guiding him through sedation. The track embodies what ketamine does emotionally. It numbs pain while revealing how close you are to shattering underneath. Sugar and Diesel shifts focus to compulsion, the cycle of addiction itself. The chorus is brutally simple. More, got to have it. No more, I can't handle it. That push and pull is exactly how ketamine operates. The craving is immediate and overwhelming, but the come down is nauseating, depressive, and destabilizing. The contrast in the title, something sweet and consumable, sugar, versus something toxic and industrial, diesel, is addiction versus something toxic and industrial, diesel, is addiction in a nutshell. Echo frames drug use not as glamorous, but as embarrassing, even humiliating. He literally says, uh-oh, that's embarrassing. Oops, no, something happened, someone please call an ambulance. That's the honesty of it, the moment when a high becomes a collapse, when you're no longer in control but still reaching for the bag. Across the album, these songs don't just name ketamine, they translate its mechanics into art. The looping structures mimic mental spirals, the airy, detached vocals mimic dissociation, the lyrics drift between bodily paralysis, compulsive cycles, and the sense of unreality that follows heavy use. And the overall sound design, sparse, translucent, digital, evokes the sterile, mechanical coldness of a K-hole compared to the warmth of psychedelic highs. What makes E beautiful and disturbing at the same time is how it refuses to glamorize. It doesn't frame ketamine as enlightenment or escapism. Instead, it presents it as fragile, compulsive, alienating, but also achingly human. It's not a straight anti-drug statement and it's not an endorsement. It's more intimate than either. It's the sound of someone caught in the middle, floating, cracked, and still reaching out. And really quick before we finish, I want to mention one more thing about ketamine that I find interesting. One of the strangest things about ketamine is how it's inspired a whole aesthetic around emptiness. Unlike psychedelics, which get tied to colorful visuals and nature and spirituality, ketamine's culture leans into imagery of blankness, empty rooms, glowing screens, sterile light, the experience of being cut off from your body and surroundings has bled into fashion, music, and online spaces, where ketamine is less about what you see and more about what disappears. In art and media, ketamine is often evoked with minimalist, washed-out visuals, pale faces, digital glitches, bodies floating in empty space. This reflects the void people describe during high doses, where everything familiar is stripped away until only fragments remain. Even the slang around ketamine, falling into the hole, entering the void, is all about absence rather than presence. And guys, that's the end of the ketamine video. Thank you for watching this far. I appreciate all of the support. Please leave a like and subscribe if you want to. It helps out a lot. Follow my Instagram if you want. Join the Discord so we can hang out. I talk in my Discord a lot. I love to talk to you guys, but yeah. Good night, everyone. Sweet dreams.